Welcome all. It's been 2.5 months since Russian forces launched an invasion of Ukraine. Though Russian forces have withdrawn from the Kiev, Chernihiv and Sumy regions, they are still holding territory in places like Kherson, Berdyansk, Donbass and other places. I'm joined now by CivilNet host and contributor Eric Hacopian to discuss this and also what this means for Armenia. So Eric, thank you again for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Where are we with regards to this war and what do we know?
Well, things have been somewhat clarified since the beginning of the war, and there's a couple of things that we know now that we didn't know at the start of the war. And the first one is that this war is actually not between Russia and Ukraine, it's actually between Russia and NATO. To the extent that Ukraine is being armed by NATO and led or helped in every possible way from intelligence to leadership. This is actually a war, a proxy war between Russia and the United States, to the extent that NATO, for the most part, to a great extent, is the United States. The second thing is that Ukraine has actually been a member of NATO, a de facto member of NATO for a long time, and likely possesses one of the most capable armies within NATO. They essentially were part of NATO except for Article 5 protections, which is the key in NATO membership, which is you can ask other people to come help you when your country is invaded and you're in danger. So, and for all practical purposes, if you look at the training and the involvement of the West, Ukraine has been a member of NATO for years. The third one is that Russia is going to, or has already lost this war politically, in the sense that it's not going to reach the goals that it wanted, or the maximalist goals, short of a national mobilization. Because if they mobilize the entire resources of the country, they can actually reach those goals, as costly as they might be. So they've essentially lost that battle. Fourth, I think Ukraine has lost the war and will lose the war. If you look at the trajectory of what's going on in the battlefield, the map essentially goes in one direction, slowly but surely. The Russians are making gains here and there, and where the Ukrainians have actually advanced in places like around the big cities, where Russians withdrew themselves tactically because their original goals failed as far as toppling the Kiev, taking over Kiev, or even if that was ever their goal. That's generally what we know for sure as far as what has what has come of this. These are the things that weren't clarified, and now they're very clear about who's what and who stands on which side.
And what do you think this means for Armenia, politically, economically, and also perhaps socially?
Start backwards. Socially, obviously, it's the impact of people who moved here, and which is will take years to decipher. Economically, to be honest with you, we still don't know, because so far we sort of wrote out what would have been the worst, as far as we have a currency that's actually gaining against the dollar. Sort of the worst of what people expected in the short run didn't happen. Now it could happen in the long run, but not in the short run. And in fact, I don't think this has done much to dent our growth. And I think some of those projections about growth rates coming down here might have been premature. Politically, it's obviously quite problematic on countless different levels. Mostly because there's a direct link between the strength or weaknesses of Russia and Aliyev's provocations in Artsakh. And we've seen there's a direct link between the two. A distracted Russia, a weak Russia, it makes mischief by the Aliyev regime in Artsakh far more likely. But as with any conflict like this, what it also does is it actually limits the maneuverability, how much room do you have to maneuver, especially for smaller states. When you have two giants fighting, it's very hard to not get stepped on by one side or the other, or be asked to, be forced to take sides when you really don't want to.
But you and many others have maintained that Armenia should take an approach of neutrality. Are you still of that opinion? And you kind of mentioned it, but do you think that, considering that both sides are so determined when it comes to this war, can Armenia expect greater pressure from abroad to get involved?
I suspect that if the war continues and if the situation gets worse, that's more likely. To this day, I will say, up to today, despite the many weaknesses of the foreign policy of this government, they've actually have managed to hold neutrality in a far greater level than I expected. If you see the way Armenians voted, in the UN, it's actually been quite courageous given our security needs that are so tied to Russia and Russia's interests. And even last week, the Armenian foreign minister was in Washington, signing agreements with the United States, which it doesn't come without costs from Russia, given how polarized everything is. So I think so far they've actually done a reasonable job of bending on either side when they need to, while not entirely taking sides, which could be quite damaging.
And you've spoken in the past about PR and narratives. I'm wondering what you think about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He has almost turned into a cultural figure globally, and the PR around him has been really exceptional and interesting. At the same time, he was in charge of Ukrainian decision-making that led to this catastrophic war. What do you think of the way he played the game and how he approached things?
Well, I mean, you have to separate the public relations angle from the politics. And let's just speak of public relations. He's been masterful, and people forget that he's an actor, and they think that's a negative. It isn't a negative. Actually, he understands modern media. He understands how to speak, and he's been absolutely masterful, especially up against a foe that, frankly, doesn't even understand public relations or even engage in it. So they have done a masterful job. Now, part of this is greatly enhanced by entire Western systems of public relations and firms and governments that are aggressively pushing the Ukrainian line. So I think, but overall, his approach has been masterful. I think, however, the thing with modern media is that it can turn nothing into something very quickly, and can just as easily turn on you and turn something into nothing very quickly. So I think he's riding high, but I think the moment the shooting stops, he's going to have to deal with the consequences of decisions he made or he didn't make, and the glow is going to be off very quickly. And he will not enjoy the popularity or the acclaim that he has around the world, and more importantly, at home.
And what do you think were or are the biggest mistakes or misunderstandings, miscalculations that were made by both sides?
Well, by both sides, I'm not going to mention Ukraine. I'm going to say the West in general. I think when you're talking about Russia, and then when you talk about Russia, you talk about Putin. I think he clearly misunderstood, one, the level of Ukrainian resistance, and to what extent Ukraine would fight, and you would not have a repeat of what happened in 2014, when the Russians very quickly and with almost no casualties took the Crimea. And to the extent that the West would coalesce so quickly, so aggressively, and come in with economic sanctions that are so strong and so aggressive, I don't think he expected that kind of a response. And I think some of it was based on what he saw with U.S. weakness in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, what a disaster that was, and he might have thought this is just an extension of, you could have the similar type of scenario with the United States on the retreat. And I think on the Western side, and I think this is actually working itself out, is they completely misunderstood that, unlike Iran, Russia cannot be isolated economically without doing tremendous damage to yourself. Because Russia is an important part of so many of the commodities around the world that are key in running the world, that if you go after Russia, yes, you can damage the Russian economy, but you can create what we likely have in many Western countries, which is stagflation, which is a combination of inflation and recession. Which is going to undermine many governments, and it already has the popularity of, you can go across from Schultz to Biden about where their numbers are at, and they're terrible, and people are not happy with the situation domestically in most of these countries. So I think they're underestimated the economic damage that the West would do to itself by the extent of Russian influence or reach on these very important commodity markets at exactly the time when the world was just starting to come out of the COVID disaster. This just compounded everything and created an inflation firestorm, which is going to take down a lot of governments in the West.
And of course, the peace talks going on between both sides have kind of stalled. What's interesting, however, is that the war holds a lot of symbolism for both sides. And you have mentioned before that it is a civilizational war. Both sides are relentless and completely determined. The phrase war of survival has been used for both sides. How do you think the war is being perceived by both sides? And do you think this could turn out to be a long, protracted conflict?
Yes, I think short of a complete Russian mobilization, what you're going to have is this Russia that is very slowly, mile here, mile there on a daily basis, advancing and taking over the Donbass and Luhansk region in their entirety, while probably trying to move towards Odessa. And you see it by the level of, fire that Odessa is receiving in the last couple of days, where they essentially would want to make Ukraine into a landlocked country. So I think this is, it's very clear that that's the direction that they're going to go in. Ukraine doesn't have, too many good options. Because at this stage, it's very hard to see a scenario in which we don't have the Syrianization of Ukraine. I think that is almost a certainty, unfortunately, because the country is being systematically destroyed. And no matter what happens at the end of it, and the attention span of the world is going to move off. This war ends 6 months from now. The world moves on to other things while you have a completely destroyed country with millions of people that are never going to come back. So I think, you have these victory in the context of Ukraine means different things. And I don't think, and obviously the Ukrainian decisions are greatly influenced by the West. We know that when Boris Johnson went to Ukraine, one of the things that he did is he scuttled whatever agreement that was coming out of the Ankara meetings. I'm sorry, the Istanbul meetings. So the West has its own agenda. Sometimes it rhymes with Kiev's agenda, and sometimes it doesn't. But when all is said and done, it's going to be Zelensky and the Ukrainians that have to deal with the consequences of what is perceived to be a victory or defeat by either side.
And you kind of mentioned, but I want to speak a bit more about the West's role. The West is providing weaponry to Ukraine, but Ukrainian pleas, for example, for a no-fly zone were not realized. How do you see the West's game when it comes to Ukraine? Is it acting out of love for Ukraine or out of hatred for Russia?
I think you have to differentiate between people and governments. I think state actors, the interest of state actors in the West is the weakening of Russia. What happens to the Ukraine is actually secondary to that. That's obviously not true of ordinary people that have sympathy for the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian side. But I think if you look at it, and the West is not a monolith. You have essentially the United States, the UK, the Baltic countries, Poland and Sweden on the one side, and then you have the more accommodationist, we'll call them, let's say the Germans and the French, that will be more open to coming up with some sort of a compromise that ends the war. So the West itself is not a monolith, but the dominant factors are the more aggressive U.S., UK, Poland sides that are pushing for a more aggressive policy. And I think it's very clear, and they've said this explicitly. U.S. Defense Secretary said this is about, we want to weaken Russia. I don't think they want any kind of a settlement, any kind of end to the war, because an end to the war is going to establish some kind of a border system that will actually become the new borders. And over time, the day the shooting stops is the day that this coalition that they put together starts falling apart. Because that's when German business interests kick in and other people start, pulling away from it. I think the maximalist factions in the West want, if this war ends, they want it to end without any clear terms, that it stays as this festering wound, that it's not settled in any way, and that it does not create any situation that the sanctions against Russia are going to be ever taken off the table. So they'll be under this constant sanctions regime. So they don't want anything that undoes that. Now, what that does to Ukraine in this process, it's it's hard to imagine, but it's not good. So I think their role is, and I think we have to be careful. This can't be anybody who thinks of this, the Ukrainians are just puppets for Western interests. That's actually not true, because in political situations, people have a tendency of using each other. Except it takes years to find out who really used who for what purpose. So I think we need to be, it's not the Ukrainians have no agency, but when it comes to the decisions to end the war, they're under tremendous influence by people whose interests might not always be theirs.
And what do you think either side is looking for in order to end the war?
It's hard to know. I think for the Russian side, frankly, this is like Ukraine is a giant honey trap, because the further they go into Ukraine, the harder it is for them to come out because of the political and the military price that you're paying. It's very hard it's going to be very hard for any Russian government, especially this one, to pull out of anything that you've played this much in blood to gain. So in some ways, the more Russia actually conquers in Ukraine, the more it loses, because it cannot, anything that it does, because it's impossible to have a peace scenario without substantial withdrawals from many of the territories that they've conquered. And that simply is not in the card. And every day that goes by, that becomes less possible because of the price paid in blood and treasure by the Russian state and Russian people. It's very hard to ask for the sacrifice and say we're going to give all of these things back. So I think this is it's a perfect trap for them, that the more they actually win, the more it becomes just harder to actually pull the country out of this. And let's put things in very real, crass terms. This is, the two greatest powers in the world, NATO and Russia, fighting over the poorest region of the poorest country in Europe, in which Ukraine itself is nearly bankrupt. They need $6 billion a month just to pay their salaries. And if the Russians end up conquering some of these areas or most of these parts of Ukraine that they want, what did they get out of it except just, a wreck of a place that's going to need billions to reconstruct? So it's almost like whoever wins loses in many ways. And unfortunately, what we don't see, which is the biggest tragedy, is any concerted effort to end this war, because first and foremost we have to stop the killing and the destruction, because Ukraine, just the infrastructure of the country is being systematically destroyed. And I think at a minimum we need to stop this, and there's almost no talk of this because people have these fantasies of what they're going to gain out of it.
And finally, how the war is being perceived in Russia is very interesting. Along with moving towards being a police state, strict rules are in place with regards to opposition to the war. Russian forces are removing any symbols of Ukraine from towns and cities. The West at least allowed for opposition when it invaded Iraq in 2003. What do you think of Russia's almost canonization of the war? Does it, again, like you say, make defeat almost not an option?
Yeah, no, I think... and I think you touched on something very interesting, is because there's this dichotomy here for anybody who has a moral perspective. If you have a moral perspective, a political one in this case, you don't want Russia to win because of it's because of the nature of the actions and what's going on. At the same time, from a political, practical point of view, you don't really want Russia to lose. And let me explain. It's because a Russia that is, if Russia is in the process of losing this war, and you're dealing with a nuclear power, and you're dealing with a state and a regime that wants to keep its powers, it will go to places where you don't want it to go. And I think what that really means is to use tactical nuclear weapons, which is not out of the question if a nuclear state thinks it's under existential, or the regime itself thinks it's under existential threat. So this is a horrible situation. There's nothing good that's going to come out of any of this by either side. And I think the best that we can hope for is the fastest possible end to the killing, and then working out some kind of a political solution that is not maximalist and is going to be distasteful and hated by all sides. But the continued destruction of Ukraine and the country and its people is not worth anything that's gained by either side.
Well, Eric, thank you for your time as always.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.